You know, you usually know exactly what to expect from a massive bonfire. I mean, you throw enough wood on it, you pour some accelerant over the pile, you strike a match, and suddenly you have this towering, roaring inferno.
Oh, absolutely. And it draws everyone in. It is just completely magnetic.
Right. You get the heat, you get the light, and when you are standing right next to it, it really feels like it has enough energy to burn forever.
It creates its own gravity, basically. I
Yeah.
mean, people will walk for miles in the dark just to stand around something that emits that much raw energy.
But there is a fundamental mechanical problem with a bonfire. I mean, it burns incredibly hot and it burns incredibly fast, but it doesn't actually take you anywhere.
No, it doesn't. It just sits in one place, consuming whatever fuel happens to be directly in front of it.
Yeah, and eventually, unless someone keeps carrying more and more wood to the center, there is nothing left but ash. The energy is entirely expended, but no actual distance was covered.
Right. And once the heat drops, the crowd inevitably disperses. They just go looking for the next fire.
Exactly. Now compare that sheer raw energy to a combustion engine. An engine is fundamentally different, even though it relies on the exact same chemical reaction.
Right. It still uses fire. It still uses combustion.
Yes, but that fire is not allowed to just burn wildly in the open air. It is heavily contained. It is ordered. The explosions are directed through a very specific architecture, pistons, gears, and a transmission.
And because of that, an engine doesn't put on a spectacular show of light for a crowd. Instead, it harnesses that energy to move a vehicle forward. It covers distance. It does actual work.
The fire is subjected to a mechanism, and because of that mechanism, the momentum becomes sustainable. It becomes scalable. Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive.
We're so glad to have you with us.
If you are joining us today, you are likely someone who loves a good aha moment. You value your time, you like looking at multiple perspectives, and you want to cut straight through the noise to understand how things actually work at a structural level.
And today we are looking at the exact difference between that bonfire and that engine applied to human movements.
Right. Our source material for this exploration is a manuscript titled Designing a National Multiplication Pathway.
Now, to set the context for you, this is an explicitly Christian manuscript. Its primary focus is on church planting, biblical discipleship, and spiritual formation.
Yes, and we want to be clear that we are approaching this impartially. We are analyzing it today because what the author is actually dissecting is the hidden architecture behind how any idea, movement, or community actually grows, reproduces, and sustains itself over time.
Exactly. The principles discussed in this text go far beyond their specific theological context.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission here is to impartially examine the mechanics described in this text. We really want to understand the fatal gap between having a great vision, which is the bonfire, and actually building a reproducible pathway, which is the engine.
Because whether you approach this from a theological angle, a sociological angle, or even if you are just thinking about how to scale a business or a community project, the manuscript presents a very specific thesis.
Right, and it's a calm but deeply insightful premise. The biggest obstacle to nationwide multiplication is not a lack of passion.
No, not at all. The premise here is that many leaders possess an abundance of vision. I mean, they can articulate a compelling future, they understand the deep needs of their communities, and they have tremendous zeal.
But the text argues that passion, operating on its own, essentially functions as a maintenance system. It might use the language of growth, but structurally it does not possess the capacity for a true multiplication movement.
So true. It just sustains what is already there.
So why do so many passionate, high-energy movements quietly stall out? The manuscript frames the argument around one central phrase: vision inspires, pathways multiply.
That phrase is the architectural core of the entire text. The author posits that without a coherent pathway like a literal step-by-step mechanism for how someone moves from point A to point B, a movement becomes entirely dependent on gifted personalities.
It becomes bottlenecked by charisma.
Exactly. You might see local communities or organizations that flourish for a season under a really dynamic leader, but the larger movement remains totally fragmented. The central figures are working incredibly hard, constantly throwing more wood on the fire, but the work itself does not travel.
Because the people in the crowd cannot repeat what they have only observed. They can admire the leader's model, but they don't have the tools to transfer it to their own lives or their own neighborhoods.
Right. The text suggests that the participants know the destination, but they just have not been given the route.
It would be like looking at a photograph of a mountain peak, deciding you want to climb it, but having absolutely no idea where the trailhead is located or what gear you need to survive the altitude.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And if we connect this to a broader sociological pattern, the author is diagnosing what they call the illusion of momentum.
Oh, the illusion of momentum. That is such a critical vulnerability in so many modern organizations.
It really is. I mean, the room is full, the calendar is completely packed, the emotional temperature of the gatherings is very high.
But the text warns that this outward success masks a quiet fragility.
Yes, because the entire ecosystem depends on a few highly capable individuals holding the center together. When that charismatic founder eventually leaves or simply burns out, the movement fractures because there is no underlying architecture to support the weight of the crowd.
Which brings us to a concept the author introduces called spiritual biology. I want to linger on this because it's just a fascinating way to frame organizational structure.
It is. The text utilizes the biblical logic of reproduction to explain why architecture is necessary for life. The author points to the creation narrative in the book of Genesis.
Right, and the argument is that God does not simply generate life in a state of chaotic explosion. Instead, creation is heavily ordered before it is filled.
Exactly. Light is separated from darkness, land is separated from water. There is a defined sequence and structure that precedes the introduction of organic life.
And the manuscript pulls several examples to reinforce this. I mean, Noah doesn't just receive a vague promise of surviving a flood, right?
No, he is handed a highly specific blueprint for an ark, complete with exact dimensions and material requirements.
And Moses doesn't just lead a spontaneous liberation movement out of Egypt and, wing it in the desert. He goes to the mountain and receives a detailed legal and covenantal structure to actually form a disorganized crowd into a functioning society.
The author uses these examples to make a case that life, particularly life that is intended to multiply, is organic, yes, but it is also highly ordered. It is not spontaneous chaos.
Even the Great Commission, which is the biblical mandate where Jesus tells his followers to make disciples of all nations, is treated in the text not as a poetic abstract slogan, but as a literal operating principle.
And operating principles require content, they require process, and they require continuity.
The author uses an analogy of a path through a dense forest to explain this. Imagine a group of people with a ton of energy and a desperate desire to get to the other side of the woods.
Right. If there is no path, they're just going to wander. They will burn thousands of calories bushwhacking, walking in circles, and getting entirely demoralized.
But if someone has taken the time to clear a path, they know exactly where to place their feet. The path doesn't do the walking for them. They still have to expend the effort, but the path makes the journey actually possible.
We should acknowledge, though, that there is often an inherent resistance to this kind of systematic structure, especially in grassroots or spiritual movements. The text itself addresses the fear that imposing a rigid structure will suffocate the organic life of the community.
Let's actually pause there and push back on this, because I think this is the exact friction point for a lot of people. Doesn't adding all this architecture, these pathways, these sequences, these structural blueprints, doesn't that cage the organic nature of human connection?
It's a very valid concern.
Right. I mean, if we are talking about spiritual formation or even just genuine community building, the moment you turn it into a flow chart or an assembly line, don't you kill the very authenticity that made it attractive in the first place?
Well, the manuscript directly anticipates that friction. The author's counterargument is that a pathway is not a cage. It is a trellis. It is a framework through which organic life can climb with clarity and consistency.
A trellis. That's a powerful image.
Yeah, and the text argues that the Holy Spirit, in a theological context, does not oppose order. Rather, the Spirit animates order. The author's stance is that the antidote to dead bureaucratic structure isn't the complete absence of structure.
Right.
The antidote is living structure. It is an architecture that is designed specifically to facilitate life rather than restrict it.
If we translate that out of the theological framework for a second, it reminds me of someone deciding they want to be a marathon runner. The vision is crossing the finish line.
Oh, definitely. You can close your eyes and visualize the crowds cheering. You can feel the tape breaking across your chest.
Exactly. That vision is beautiful, and it's totally necessary to motivate you. But the pathway is the grueling, highly structured, deeply unromantic daily training schedule.
It's the alarm going off at 5 in the morning on Tuesday so you can run 6 miles in the freezing rain.
Yes. If you just rely on the spontaneous inspiration to run, you will never finish the race. The structure is what actually creates the endurance.
That parallel aligns very well with the text's thesis. The vision provides the training schedule with its meaning, but the training schedule is the mechanism that alters your physical capacity to cross the finish line.
And the author summarizes this dynamic by contrasting aspiration with architecture, right?
Yes, aspiration says, this beautiful thing must happen. Architecture says, this is the exact, repeatable, step-by-step sequence of how it can happen.
So if raw passion isn't enough and noble aspiration isn't enough, what are the actual building blocks of a movement that can scale without losing its soul?
Well, the manuscript doesn't just leave us with the theory that architecture is good. It outlines 4 specific inseparable realities. It calls these the 4 pillars of coherent multiplication.
Which are vision, values, pathways, and outcomes.
Exactly. And it is critical to look at how the text links these 4 pillars.
Hmm.
The author insists they function as an integrated ecology. You really cannot pick and choose among them.
If you isolate them, the whole mechanism breaks down. To understand why, we need to look at the specific definitions the text assigns to each pillar. Let's start with the first one, which is vision. The manuscript uses a very particular phrase here. It calls vision obedient imagination.
Vision, in this framework, answers the fundamental question of why. Why are we doing this? Why does this matter? But the text draws a hard line between biblical vision and mere human ambition or corporate forecasting.
Right, it defines obedient imagination as the capacity to look at reality and see what a commitment to faithfulness could produce.
Yes, it is not just wishful thinking, and it isn't just a strategic preference based on market research.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The examples used here are quite striking. The text points to the historical figure of Nehemiah. For context, Nehemiah is looking at the city of Jerusalem after it has been completely destroyed.
Right, the walls are literally reduced to rubble.
Exactly. Everyone else standing there just sees debris, defeat, and an impossible cleanup job. But Nehemiah applies obedient imagination. He looks at the exact same rubble, but he sees a rebuilt wall and a restored people. He allows a future shaped by promises to override the constraints of the present reality.
That's a fantastic way to phrase it. Vision provides the ultimate destination. But a destination alone is dangerous without boundaries, which brings us to the second pillar, which is values.
Okay, so if vision answers why, values answer the question of what must never be lost along the way.
Exactly. They act as the guardrails on the highway.
The guardrails, right.
The text lists values such as a reliance on scripture, a dependence on prayer, the necessity of local leadership, and mutual accountability. These are the non-negotiable boundaries that preserve the core identity, the DNA of the movement.
And the author warns that if an organization focuses purely on expanding its vision but neglects its values, it might successfully scale, but it will lose its soul in the process.
Yes, it will undergo a mutation rather than a true multiplication.
Which naturally requires the third pillar, which is pathways. We touched on this earlier, but to define it formally within the 4 pillars, pathways answer the question of how.
How does the movement actually function on a Tuesday afternoon? It is the sequence. It is the literal road that translates the high-minded aspiration into concrete action.
And finally, the 4th pillar is outcomes. Outcomes answer the question of what does real fruit look like? This is the demand for visible evidence.
The manuscript argues that a healthy movement cannot exist purely in the realm of theory. It must look for actual, observable changes in reality.
Things like new people joining, individuals exhibiting changed behavior, new leaders taking responsibility, and new communities being formed.
Exactly. To ground this in a historical example, the text uses the early church in the book of Acts to show how all 4 of these pillars were functioning simultaneously.
And the author points out that the early Christian movement wasn't just a spontaneous explosion of enthusiasm. They had a very clear architecture.
Yes, the text notes that they devoted themselves to teaching, to shared meals, and to prayer. They had a system for appointing leaders. They had a mechanism for resolving internal disputes.
So they possessed a vision for reaching new demographics, values that dictated their ethical boundaries, pathways for instructing new converts, and highly visible outcomes as new communities proliferated across the region.
It was a complete functional ecology.
Now, conceptually, it all sounds perfectly reasonable when you describe the 4 pillars working in total harmony. You have the engine tuned, mounted, and running smoothly.
Right.
But here is where the manuscript takes a fascinating turn. It shifts from theory to diagnostics. It breaks down exactly what happens when an organization or a movement loses just one of those 4 pillars.
This section is incredible. It reads less like a theological treatise and much more like a deep dive into organizational psychology and system failure.
It really does. It is a rigorous diagnostic matrix. The author explores system failures by creating scenarios where three elements are present, but one is fundamentally missing.
And the resulting dysfunctions are highly recognizable, regardless of what kind of organization you're looking at.
So let's walk through these failure modes. First scenario. What happens if an organization has vision, pathways, and outcomes, but they have completely lost their values?
The text argues that vision without values results in ambition or pure ego.
Consider the mechanics of this failure. You have a destination, you have a process to get there, and you are rigorously tracking your results. But you have no guardrails regarding how you achieve those results.
Exactly. The author observes that this is where movements become toxic or corrupt. The leadership becomes obsessed with the outcomes, like the speed of growth, the scale of the expansion, and they sacrifice depth and character to achieve it.
And the text notes that in this state, the language of the movement might still sound noble or prophetic, but the actual operation is purely pragmatic.
Yes, it becomes an exercise in image management and institutional ego.
I think anyone who has worked in a hyper-growth startup can recognize that exact pathology. You hit the growth targets, but the culture becomes utterly ruthless because the foundational values were discarded for speed.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very common corporate trap.
Okay, second failure scenario. You have the values, you have the pathways, and you are tracking the outcomes, but you have lost the vision.
The text says outcomes without vision equals hollow statistics.
Hollow statistics. This is the definition of institutional drift.
It really is. The organization is still running the machinery. They are still counting the metrics. How many people attended, how much money was raised, how many groups were formed.
But because the overarching why has been forgotten, the numbers are stripped of their meaning.
Their author argues that they cease to be interpretive signs of a living mission and just become sterile data points. The organization is meticulously tracking what happened, but no one can remember what the counting is actually for.
It's the bureaucracy that exists solely to perpetuate itself. So the third scenario shifts the missing piece again. You have the vision, you hold tightly to the values, and you want the outcomes, but you have no pathways.
The text states that values without pathways results in sentiment.
Sentiment. This is perhaps the most paralyzing failure because it feels so well-intentioned.
Yes, the author describes a scenario where a community feels deeply passionate about their ideals. They affirm all the correct beliefs, they speak eloquently about their goals, but absolutely no one knows how to execute.
The grand ideals remain unembodied. Because there is no sequence to actually train people, the vision never materializes into reality.
Right, it remains a warm collective feeling. It is pure sentiment, masking an inability to act.
You just have a room full of people aggressively agreeing with each other, but nothing changes when they walk out the door.
Exactly.
The final scenario is the one I find the most insidious. You have the vision, you have the values, and you have built the pathways, but you refuse to measure outcomes.
The text argues that pathways without outcomes equals activity or busyness.
This raises the critical issue of what the author terms invisible success, or premature release sometimes. An organization can feel incredibly vital because the schedule is packed. Everyone is exhausted from operating the pathways.
The calendar is full of events, but the text warns that human nature is remarkably adept at mistaking motion for momentum.
Mistaking motion for momentum, we really need to pull that apart because it happens everywhere.
It does. It happens because we naturally default to measuring what is easy rather than what is meaningful.
Right.
The author points out that it is very easy to count attendance or hours worked or events hosted. It is much harder to measure actual transformation, obedience, or character development.
So a community that never pauses to honestly evaluate whether its activities are producing actual intended changes may remain incredibly busy, but the text is blunt. Busy is not synonymous with fruitful.
To illustrate this tension between system failure and true coherence, the manuscript provides a comparative case study of two different organizations operating in the same environment.
The contrast is illuminating. Let's look at the first group. They operate with an enormous vision. They are led by a highly charismatic individual, their public gatherings are inspiring, and they draw a large crowd.
However, they lack a clear, reproducible pathway for development. Consequently, after several years, the organization is vibrant but completely bottlenecked at the top.
Right. The structure relies entirely on centralized talent. The participants remain consumers. They absorb the content, but they are never equipped or expected to reproduce the work themselves.
And then the text contrasts that with the second group. This one starts much smaller, perhaps flying entirely under the radar, but they possess structural clarity.
They know their vision, they refuse to compromise their values, they have a defined pathway that takes someone from initial contact to mature leadership, and they rigorously evaluate their outcomes.
Yes, and the author notes that over time, this second group functions as a seedbed. Capacity is constantly multiplying.
New leaders are trained and released, new groups are formed, and the movement expands organically because the underlying architecture supports decentralized life.
It's a completely different trajectory.
I want to stop here and play devil's advocate regarding this heavy emphasis on outcomes. As I was reading the manuscript, particularly the section demanding visible evidence and metrics, I felt a strong wave of skepticism. Let's look at this critically.
Sure.
Doesn't introducing metrics, measurement, and outcome tracking turn a community or a spiritual mission into the exact corporate machine we often try to escape? Doesn't reducing human transformation to measurable outcomes strip people of their humanity and turn them into widgets on an organizational spreadsheet?
Well, the author directly addresses that exact discomfort, recognizing that many view metrics as inherently cold or corporate. But the manuscript offers a sharp reframing.
Okay, how so?
It argues that metrics, when used correctly, are not the master of the movement. They are a mercy. The text posits a challenging idea. Refusing to look at outcomes isn't actually a noble way of protecting the purity of the mission. It is usually a defense mechanism for protecting the leader's feelings.
But wait, how do you measure something as internal and subjective as personal transformation? I mean, if someone becomes more compassionate, you can't put that on a graph. By demanding outcomes, aren't you forcing the organization to focus only on superficial behaviors just so they have something to count?
That is the danger, yes. But the text challenges the assumption that true internal change is invisible. The author argues that a changed nature will inevitably produce visible evidence.
Right.
If someone's internal value system shifts, like if they genuinely become less greedy or more forgiving or more willing to serve others, that will manifest in observable actions.
So the argument is that looking for these outcomes is a form of reality testing. It prevents the organization from slipping into delusion.
Exactly. If leaders celebrate how hard they are working on the pathways, but completely ignore the fact that no one is actually changing or growing, they are living in a fiction. Demanding evidence forces the organization to tell the truth about whether their efforts are actually effective.
So we have established that we need all four pillars: the vision, the values, the pathways, and the outcomes to keep the engine mounted and directed. But what are the actual gears inside that engine?
Right.
If we zoom in on the pathway pillar itself, how does a person actually move from being a complete outsider to a fully formed participant who can reproduce the movement?
The manuscript breaks this internal pathway down into sequential stages. Let's examine this progression starting with the initial phases: entry and discovery.
And the author is adamant that these stages must occur in order, right? You cannot bypass the beginning.
Absolutely not. The first stage is entry, which the text refers to as the front door. The architectural rule for this stage is that the entry point must be accessible, highly relational, and entirely honest. The guiding principle is encounter over complexity.
In practical terms, that means you don't demand that a newcomer master the entire organizational philosophy or theological framework before they are allowed to sit at the table.
Precisely. The text looks at the historical accounts of Jesus as the archetype of a pathway builder. It highlights that he consistently met individuals within their own context.
He didn't require them to achieve a certain level of social polish or master a set of religious doctrines before initiating contact.
Right. The examples cited, like speaking with a marginalized woman at a public well or approaching a tax collector at his place of business, demonstrate a willingness to cross cultural thresholds rather than forcing the outsider to do all the navigational work.
And the manuscript explicitly points out a pervasive flaw in many modern institutions: the reliance on insider language.
Oh, yes. That is a huge barrier.
Whether it's a church using theological jargon, a tech company using impenetrable acronyms, or a fitness subculture relying on specialized slang, the effect is the same. It forces the seeker to decode a foreign language just to cross the threshold.
The text argues that a newcomer shouldn't have to navigate a maze of institutional complexity just to figure out what the community is actually about.
The author makes a crucial distinction here, however. Making the entry point accessible does not equate to diluting or compromising the core message.
No, not at all. It is about identifying and removing unnecessary cultural or institutional barriers so that the actual challenge of the core message can be clearly understood and engaged with.
To illustrate this, the manuscript tells a story called The Faithful Doorway, and I think this narrative perfectly captures the mechanics of the entry stage.
It really does.
It describes a village where the local population has only heard distorted fragments about this particular faith, and they have never actually interacted with a practitioner. One individual decides to act as the front door. He doesn't rent a hall and start giving lectures.
Right. He simply engages in acts of presence. He listens to his neighbors, he assists with practical needs, and eventually he begins opening his home once a week for tea and open conversation.
If we analyze the architecture of that story, the pathway is remarkably simple. There is no high-pressure sales pitch. It functions purely as a doorway.
The neighbors initially attend out of mild curiosity, but they return because the environment is safe and completely devoid of manipulation.
And over time, the casual conversation naturally transitions into deeper inquiries. Eventually, a family asks to read the foundational text together, and what began as an incredibly low-barrier entry point slowly matures into a self-sustaining community group.
But that transition from drinking tea to actually reading the text and changing their lives requires crossing a threshold. And that moves us into the second stage of the pathway, which is discovery.
The text defines discovery as the specific moment when abstract truth ceases to be distant and becomes intensely personal.
Yes, it is a psychological shift from merely absorbing information to recognizing a compelling reality that demands a response.
The text draws a sharp line between possessing intellectual information and experiencing actual conviction, doesn't it?
It does. It notes that an individual can be fluent in the language of a movement, and they can admire its moral principles for years without ever internalizing it in a way that alters their trajectory.
Discovery is defined as the moment that internal threshold is crossed.
The author references a moment in the Book of Acts where a large crowd is listening to a public address. The text notes that they don't just find the speech intellectually stimulating. The narrative says they are pierced to the heart, and they immediately ask the speaker, "What shall we do?"
The manuscript argues that this specific question, "What shall we do?" is the unmistakable sound of the discovery stage. It is the shift from passive observation to active implication. So what does this all mean?
Well, the manuscript also issues a severe warning to leadership regarding this stage. It cautions against the desire to manufacture premature certainty.
Right. There is a strong temptation within driven organizations to force a quick decision or manipulate an emotional environment to secure a commitment before the individual has truly grappled with the implications.
Exactly. The author argues that genuine discovery cannot be rushed. People require the time and space to ask difficult foundational questions and to let the reality of the concepts fully integrate into their understanding.
You cannot optimize or shortcut the harvest. It takes the time it takes, but once someone does cross that threshold, once they have that genuine moment of discovery and ask, "What shall we do?" what happens next?
How do you ensure they don't remain a perpetual beginner?
Exactly. This brings us to what appears to be the most labor-intensive, time-consuming stage of the entire pathway: formation.
The formation stage is where the architecture does its heaviest lifting. The text describes this phase as the process where belief becomes pattern.
Belief becomes pattern. We need to unpack that because it highlights the massive gap between intellectual assent and actual behavioral change.
It is the prolonged, often arduous period where the initial realization of truth begins to systematically rewire a person's habits, reactions, and internal life.
It is the difference between signing a document that says, "I value health," and actually overhauling your diet, your sleep schedule, and your daily routines to reflect that value.
The author draws a critical contrast here between information transfer and genuine apprenticeship. In many modern contexts, formation is reduced to a classroom model.
Right, we assume that if we provide enough lectures, books, and deep dives, the transfer of knowledge will automatically result in maturity.
But the text argues that while information is necessary, it is totally insufficient on its own. Apprenticeship is an embodied process. It requires proximity to a mentor.
It involves observing a model, attempting the behavior yourself, inevitably failing, receiving specific correction, and trying again.
Let's pull away from the theological language for a moment and use a completely secular analogy.
Okay.
It is the difference between memorizing a menu at a high-end restaurant and actually walking into the kitchen to learn how to cook.
Oh, that's good. You can read the recipe book cover to cover. You can know the exact chemical composition of every ingredient.
Right. But until you stand over a hot stove, burn a pan of expensive food, and have the head chef correct your technique, you are not a cook. You are just a person who knows a lot of facts about food.
True formation requires the heat of the kitchen, the repetition of the tasks, and the humility to be corrected.
That analogy maps perfectly onto the author's critique of passive consumption. The manuscript warns that an individual can sit in a gathering for decades, consistently consuming high-quality content, and never actually develop the foundational habits required of the movement.
Without the kitchen of apprenticeship, they may never learn how to actively forgive an offense, how to manage their resources generously, or how to maintain personal integrity when no one is watching.
The text provides a detailed narrative about a woman named Ruth to ground this concept in reality. Ruth experiences that moment of discovery, but she isn't immediately handed a microphone or rushed into a leadership position.
Right, instead she enters the formation stage. She is paired with an experienced mentor. The narrative reveals that she struggles with a deep, entrenched bitterness from her past.
And the mentor doesn't shame her, but also doesn't ignore the issue. Instead, there is a slow, deliberate process of guiding her through specific practices of reflection and forgiveness.
Over a period of many months, the architecture of her life changes. Her immediate reactions to stress change. The way she speaks about others shifts. It is a slow, methodical rewiring of her character.
What's fascinating here is the underlying mechanism for this transformation. It's something the author terms cruciform transformation.
If we translate that theological concept into its psychological equivalent, it is essentially the systematic dismantling of the ego.
Exactly. The author is explicit that this stage of formation is not merely a religious version of self-help, where the goal is just to polish the existing personality and make the person slightly more efficient.
Right. It is a fundamental reorientation. The old self, the ego-driven, self-protecting, self-advancing operating system has to be actively dismantled.
Because of this, a person who has truly passed through this formation stage will begin to view core human drivers like money, time, power, and interpersonal conflict through an entirely different lens than the surrounding culture.
But even the most rigorous formation process isn't an end in itself. If we go back to the restaurant analogy, a healthy apprentice doesn't just stay in the back of the same kitchen taking orders forever.
No, if the system is working, eventually they have to take what they've mastered and open their own restaurant.
And that brings us to the final stages of the pathway outlined in the manuscript: sending and reproduction.
This is the critical juncture where the movement either successfully scales or hits its ceiling and stagnates. The sending stage is the moment when the apprentice transitions into an active agent of the mission.
The text articulates this transition by stating that at a certain point, the grace that was received must be converted into responsibility.
Yes, what has been carefully poured into the individual must now be entrusted to them to pour out for others.
And I think it's vital to highlight a specific point the author makes here. Sending someone out is not a graduation from the core identity of the movement.
Right. It is not an exit strategy. It is the ultimate expression of the movement's DNA.
The manuscript challenges a very common structural flaw in modern institutions: the creation of a false binary between the ordinary participants and the specialized leaders.
It argues that a healthy architecture assumes that all fully formed participants will eventually be sent out in some capacity.
If a movement relies entirely on a professional class of experts to expand, it will always be limited by the size of its payroll.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In a genuinely reproducing movement, it is the ordinary individuals, the teachers, the mechanics, the shopkeepers, who become the primary carriers of the core message.
The manuscript uses a brilliant phrase for this: the portable gospel. The idea is that the DNA of the movement must be compact and resilient enough to move through ordinary networks without requiring extraordinary centralized infrastructure.
It doesn't require a multi-million-dollar facility, a professional marketing team, or a charismatic speaker to survive. It lives entirely within the habits and practices of the people.
The author also delves into the psychology of why institutions often resist this stage, which is so interesting.
Yes, there is a deep structural fear of sending. Institutions naturally prioritize self-preservation, which means they want to retain their best talent.
Releasing your most mature, capable people to go start something entirely new often feels like a loss to the central organization. It introduces instability.
But the text argues that this hoarding of talent is ultimately fatal. It uses the metaphor of water. If a body of water only receives and never releases, it becomes a stagnant reservoir.
A movement must choose to function as a flowing stream, even if that means constantly giving away its best resources.
The manuscript offers one final story to illustrate this, following a man named Daniel. He has walked the entire length of the pathway.
Right. He was reached through a low barrier entry point, he experienced personal discovery, and he submitted to the slow, ego-dismantling work of formation.
Once he is mature, the organization doesn't keep him around just to manage internal programs. They recognize his capacity and send him to a neighboring district to begin the process again.
And the key detail is how he enters that new space. He doesn't arrive acting like an authoritative hero with the polished presentation.
No, he enters as a servant. He begins by listening, he finds ways to serve the community, he slowly introduces the core texts, and eventually he facilitates the formation of a brand new, reproducing group.
That narrative embodies the ultimate objective defined in the text, which is true reproduction. The author draws a stark contrast between addition and multiplication.
An organization can add members for years without ever reproducing its core DNA. A central hub can grow massive through addition, but true multiplication only occurs when the life of the movement has taken root so deeply in the participants that it can generate new life entirely independent of the original founder.
But let me push back on this decentralized model, because this is where a lot of systems break down in the real world. If you decentralize everything, if you hand this portable gospel over to ordinary people and tell them to reproduce it in their own living rooms or cafes or workplaces, don't you inevitably lose control of the core identity?
That is the fear, certainly.
It sounds like a massive game of telephone. The message gets passed from person to person, adapting to each new environment. And by the fourth generation, doesn't it become distorted? Doesn't the whole thing just mutate into something unrecognizable?
That is the classic tension of any scalable network: control versus expansion. The author addresses this tension directly by exploring the concept of contextualization versus compromise.
Okay, contextualization versus compromise.
The goal is not rigid uniformity, but contextual faithfulness. The text returns to the analogy of a biological seed. A seed contains an immense amount of life, encoded in a very compact, resilient format.
When you take that seed and plant it in a new geographic environment, the outward expression of the plant will adapt to the local soil, the weather, and the available light.
Exactly. The style, the language used, the pacing of the gatherings, the cultural aesthetics, those will all look different. But the internal DNA, the commitment to the core texts, the reliance on prayer, the ethical boundaries, the mission itself remains structurally identical.
So the argument is that you have to be willing to let the packaging change radically as long as the internal substance remains untouched.
The author suggests that a truly reproducing movement does not fear cultural variation because its identity is rooted in its core substance, not in its superficial style.
However, this requires an immense amount of humility from the initial leaders.
Yes, they have to willingly surrender their desire to micromanage the aesthetics of the movement, trusting that the underlying architecture they built during the formation stage is strong enough to hold up in a new environment.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, unpacking the hidden mechanics of how movements are actually built.
We really have.
We started by dismantling the illusion that sheer passion and a charismatic leader are enough to sustain growth. That is the bonfire model, burning bright but ultimately burning out.
And we explored the absolute necessity of the four pillars working in tandem: the obedient imagination of vision, the unyielding guardrails of values, the practical mechanics of pathways, and the reality check of visible outcomes.
We analyzed how losing even one of those pillars leads directly to system failures like institutional ego, paralyzing sentiment, aimless busyness, or hollow statistics.
And then we traced the literal architecture of the pathway itself. We saw how a movement must provide a low-barrier, honest entry point. We looked at the critical threshold of discovery where abstract ideas become personal conviction.
We spent time in the crucible of formation, examining how belief is slowly hammered into behavioral patterns through apprenticeship and the dismantling of the ego.
And finally, we look at sending and reproduction, where the movement trusts its people enough to become a portable, self-replicating force, choosing to be a flowing stream rather than a stagnant reservoir.
The framework laid out in designing a national multiplication pathway is intensely challenging, regardless of your background. Whether you are listening to this because you are trying to understand the sociology of religious movements, attempting to build a sustainable culture in your startup, or honestly just trying to implement lasting habits in your own personal life, the core takeaway demands a shift in perspective.
It really does. A beautiful aspiration will only get you to the starting line.
If you actually want to cross the finish line, and if you want others to cross it with you, you need the architecture. You have to build the literal step-by-step mechanism that translates your values into a reality.
To return to our initial metaphor, You have to stop throwing wood on a bonfire and start doing the hard structural work of building an engine.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, building on the concepts we've unpacked today. Look closely at the structures you are currently investing your time and energy into.
The ultimate test of any structure, whether it is a community organization, a corporate team, or your own personal legacy, is not how massive it can grow while you are standing in the center, acting as the charismatic glue holding it all together.
No, the true test of a structure is whether the life inside it has been designed to be portable. Is it capable of surviving, adapting, and multiplying long after you have stepped away?
That is the defining difference between a temporary gathering and a permanent movement.
So as you look at your own work this week, ask yourself, are you just hosting a spectacular event that will eventually expire, or are you building a pathway that endures? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you some practical blueprints to examine your own architecture. Keep asking the hard questions, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for your time. Keep analyzing the structures around you.